There is a single sentence buried in a private memoir, published in West Germany in 1961, that has haunted military historians for 60 years. It was written by a man named Werner Kortenhaus. He was an officer in an SS Panzer Grenadier unit, and by the winter of 1944, he had seen everything a soldier in the Second World War could reasonably be expected to see. He had fought at Kursk, where the Soviet defense turned the steppe into a slaughterhouse. He had held lines against the British in Normandy. He had buried friends in 3 countries, and then, in late December of 1944, in a frozen Belgian forest outside a town called Bastogne, he wrote this in his field journal. "We were not fighting men. We were fighting something that had decided not to die." He was not being dramatic. He was a professional soldier writing for himself, in private, with no audience to impress. He was trying to describe in language a tactical reality that he could not fit into any framework he had been trained to use. What Kortenhaus had run into, in those woods, was the 101st Airborne Division of the United States Army. And what happened between his men and theirs over the next 2 weeks changed. What a generation of German officers believed was possible for human beings to endure. This is not the version of the story you have seen in the movies. There are no swelling orchestras here, no slow-motion flags. What there is instead is something quieter and considerably more disturbing. It is the record of what happened where the most elite ground assault force in the German army came into sustained contact with American paratroopers who appeared, to the men attacking them, to have stopped recognizing retreat as a category that existed in the world. To understand why the SS could not break Bastogne, you have to start a long way from Belgium. You have to start at a place called Camp Claiborne in Louisiana in August of 1942. That was where the Army activated the 101st Airborne Division. The men they took in were not in any obvious sense special. They came from farms in Iowa and steel mills in Pennsylvania, from fishing towns in Maine and factory floors in Detroit. They were ordinary young Americans. The Army took them, and it spent the next 2 years pulling them apart and putting them back together as something the world had not quite seen before. The training was brutal in a way that did not have much to do with push-ups. The physical part was real, but the physical part was secondary. What the Army was actually trying to manufacture was a particular kind of mind. A mind that, when the drop scattered the unit across 40 miles of enemy territory, when the radio was dead and the officer was dead, and the nearest friendly unit was 12 miles away, through woods full of Germans, would look at all of that and decide it was still a problem with a solution. General William Lee, who built the American Airborne, put it this way. He said he wanted men who understood that the word surrounded simply meant the enemy was now in range in all directions. It sounded like a joke. It was not a joke. It was an operational philosophy, and it was about to be tested in a way nobody at Camp Claiborne had imagined. If stories like this one interest you, I track down a forgotten piece of this war every week. Subscribe if that sounds like your kind of thing. On December 16th of 1944, the German army did something nobody on the Allied side believed it could still do. It attacked. The plan was called Wacht am Rhein, and it was Hitler's last serious gamble. 3 SS Panzer divisions, leading a force of nearly 500,000 men, were to punch through a thinly held American sector in the Ardennes forest, drive northwest to the port of Antwerp, split the Allied armies in half, and force a negotiated peace before the Russians arrived in Berlin. For the first 48 hours, it almost worked. The assault hit American lines held mostly by green units, or by veteran divisions that had been pulled back specifically because they were exhausted. Entire companies were overrun in the dark. Some were captured before they understood what was happening. The fog of war was complete, and into that fog, the Allied command made the decision that would define everything that followed. They called the 101st. The Screaming Eagles were in Reims, in France. They had just come off Operation Market Garden in the Netherlands, a campaign that had used them harder than airborne units are supposed to be used. They needed rest. They needed resupply. They needed winter clothing that had not yet arrived. What they got was about 18 hours On December 17th, the order came down. They climbed into trucks, most of them still in their standard field uniforms. The temperature was already below freezing and falling fast. Many were in open vehicles. Some had not eaten a real meal in 2 days. They drove through the night toward a battle that, from everything they could hear, was already lost. And as they drove forward, they passed Americans going the other way, combat veterans, men who had been in the fight and were now out of it. Those men shouted at the paratroopers from the side of the road. They said the Germans had tanks. They said the SS was coming. They said it was over. The 101st listened to all of it, and they kept driving toward the guns. The perimeter they were asked to hold around Bastogne was about 50 kilometers around. They had roughly 15,000 men inside it, and a meaningful number of those were support troops, not frontline infantry. Their artillery had almost no shells. Their medical supplies were inadequate before the fighting even started. They had no winter gear. Outside, the temperature dropped to -20 Celsius. The forest floor froze hard as concrete. Wounded men who lay still for more than a few minutes began to die from the cold, and the Germans surrounding them had 5 divisions, with armor, with artillery, with numerical superiority in every category that doctrine says decides battles. The encirclement closed on December 21st. The 101st was alone. The next morning, the German commander, General Heinrich von Luttwitz, sent officers under a white flag to deliver a formal ultimatum. Surrender Bastogne. Continued resistance would result in the complete annihilation of American forces inside the town. The acting American commander was a brigadier general named Anthony McAuliffe. He read the ultimatum. His staff stood around him and waited. He said one word: nuts. His staff asked him what he wanted in the written reply. He told them to use that, just that. The note that went back to the German lines read, in full to the German commander: nuts, the American commander. The German officers asked the American, who delivered it, what the word meant. He told them it was the equivalent of go to hell. They carried the message back. And the SS began to attack. These were not probes. These were full-scale assaults with armor and infantry, designed to crack the American line in one place and roll the rest of it up from inside. The Germans drove their tanks at the paratroopers' positions, expecting the men in those frozen holes to break. Doctrine said they would break. Doctrine had numbers behind it. Doctrine was wrong. A Wehrmacht operations officer named Major Herbert Bucks wrote a report that survives. He wrote that the American parachutists defended every position, as though the word retreat had been struck from their vocabulary. He wrote that the Germans took ground only at costs that made the ground worthless. That is a remarkable sentence from a professional soldier. He is not flattering his enemy. He is telling his own superiors that the assumptions underneath their entire plan were not holding. An SS lieutenant named Klaus Rademacher, wounded by a grenade fragment on the 23rd, wrote home from a field hospital. His unit had just lost 2 tanks failing to take a position held by about 80 Americans. He wrote that the Americans were not fighting from a foxhole. They were fighting from inside themselves. He wrote that there was something wrong with them, something that made them more dangerous than any soldier he had fought. Inside the perimeter, the war was being held together by individual men whose names mostly never made it into the history books. There was a sergeant named Leighton Black. He was 22 years old, from Harlan County, Kentucky, serving as a combat medic with the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment. On the night of December 23rd, his aid station was hit directly by an SS assault. There were wounded inside who could not be moved. Black, armed with a pistol and a wounded man's carbine, held the entrance for about 40 minutes until help arrived. When the relief got there, they found 3 dead Germans at the threshold, and Black still on his feet, with a bayonet wound in his left arm he had not bothered to mention. Asked about it later, in the understated manner of men from that part of Kentucky, he said he had been too busy to leave. There was a private first class named Vernon Hort from Columbus, Ohio, a machine gunner with the 327th Glider Infantry. On Christmas Eve, his position was attacked by a German armored column, a Panzer IV, 40 tons of steel coming through the dark. Hort's machine gun could not penetrate tank armor. Every soldier on the line knew this. When a tank comes for a machine gun position, the crew has two options: move or stay. Hort stayed. He fired at the infantry behind the tank, broke up the assault's cohesion, bought time for a bazooka team to get into position. The Panzer's main gun fired twice in his direction. The second round threw him several meters. He got up. He found his gun. He kept firing. Somebody asked him why he had not pulled back when the tank came. He said something that has the quality of being completely simple and completely true. He said, "That was my gun. Those were my guys. What else was I going to do?" It is not a heroic line. It is the line of a man who had genuinely rearranged his priorities in advance, so thoroughly that the option of leaving his position was no longer in the menu his mind offered him. He was not being brave in the way we use the word when we want courage to sound like a gift. He had made a prior decision. The Germans kept running into this. Not one man making a stand. An entire division of men who had each, separately, made the same prior decision. The most striking German document to come out of the battle was written in January of 1945 by an SS lieutenant colonel named Otto Dinse, a senior staff officer with the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich. Das Reich was not a unit you could intimidate. Its officers averaged 3 years of combat. They had fought at Kursk. They had fought across France in 1940. They had spent 3 straight years in the Soviet Union. Dinse's assessment was captured by the Allies and later studied at the U.S. Army War College. He does not blame American material or air power or supply. He focuses on something he calls psychologische Immobilität, psychological immobility. He writes that the American paratrooper appears to have been conditioned to treat the abandonment of a position as a form of personal failure rather than a tactical option. He writes that this produces defensive cohesions which is nearly impossible to break by conventional assault. An SS officer, in a serious staff document, telling his superiors that the reason they could not break the 101st was not firepower. It was psychology. He was right. And the psychology was not an accident. It was what came out of the other end of 2 years of training designed to filter out everyone who would choose to stop when stopping became the reasonable option. Christmas Day 1944. -22°C inside the perimeter. The 101st had been in continuous combat for more than a week. Ammunition was critical. Wounded men who needed surgery were getting field dressings and prayer because the field hospitals had nothing else to give. And the Germans came again. 5 SS divisions launched a coordinated pre-dawn assault. They achieved a brief penetration on the western edge, in the village of Champs, before being stopped. The fighting was room to room. Men who had been in their holes for 8 days, men whom the cold was injuring as efficiently as the enemy, fought through houses with rifles and grenades, and, in several documented cases, with entrenching tools. An SS lieutenant named Hans Menges, commanding a tank, wrote in his logbook that afternoon. He wrote that his unit had gained 300 meters that morning and lost 47 men taking them. The Americans took the meters back by nightfall. He wrote that he had no words for what these men were. By the time the siege was broken at the end of the month, the German files contained more testimony about the 101st than about any other American formation in the theater. An SS captain named Friedrich Holzer, who had fought at Kharkov, wrote that in 12 months on the Eastern Front he had never encountered troops who made him question whether Germany could win. After Bastogne, he wrote, he questioned it every day. A Wehrmacht artillery captain named Hans Vogelsang, in a memoir published in West Germany in 1958, wrote about a phrase his men had used on the Eastern Front. They called a position amerikanisch verteidigt, defended like an American, when it was held past the point of rational military logic. He said they had not meant it as a compliment when they coined it. By the time he came home from the Ardennes, he was no longer sure it was not one. And von Luttwitz himself, the same general who had sent the surrender ultimatum, wrote in his post-war memoirs the most devastating sentence a commander can write. He said he had been asked many times why he did not take Bastogne. The honest answer, he wrote, was that he had not taken it because the men defending it had decided that they would not allow it to be taken, and he had had no operational response to that decision. That is what it looks like when doctrine breaks. When you bring everything the manual says should work, and the manual turns out not to cover what the other side has chosen. The 1st came out of the Ardennes campaign with about 19,000 casualties, killed, wounded, missing. What they had been through was not really a battle in the textbook sense. It was an extended experiment in where the absolute edge of human endurance sits, and the edge turned out to be further out than the Germans, or anyone else, had believed. Werner Kortenhaus, the SS officer who began this story, lived through the war. He was captured in April of 1945, held for 18 months, and released into a Germany that was trying to work out what it was now allowed to be. He wrote his memoir in private and printed a small run in 1961. The chapter on Bastogne is by far the longest in the book. It is almost 3 times the length of any other chapter. Near the end of it, he describes a specific night in the forest south of the town. His unit was forming up to assault an American position. The snow muffled everything so completely, he said, that the men gathered for the attack almost in silence. Then the American line opened fire. He writes that they fired as if they had been waiting specifically for his men at precisely that moment, as if they had decided before he had even arrived that they were going to stay, that they were going to hold, that they were not going to let him through. And he writes that he came at them with everything his unit had, and they did not let him through. He writes that he had been at war for 4 years by that point. He had never before had the experience of attacking a position and feeling, with absolute certainty, that the men inside it were not going to move. He says that feeling was new to him. He says he had not, in the 17 years between the battle and the book, found adequate language for it. Then he writes a sentence that you only write when you have given up on language doing the work. He writes, "What those men were, they were. What those men were, they were." It is not a sophisticated sentence. It is what you put down when you have spent half your life trying to say something correctly, and you have accepted that words are not going to get there, and all that is left is the fact of the thing. The SS came to Bastogne believing they were going to fight a rich nation's pampered children, boys who would fold the moment the cold set in and the ammunition ran low. What they met instead was 15,000 Americans, mostly in their early 20s, mostly from small towns and middle-class houses and working families, who had decided, individually and together, that this was the place, that these were the people they were going to fight beside, and that whatever came at them out of the dark was going to have to deal with that decision first. The Germans, in their staff papers, called it psychologische Immobilität. The Americans never called it anything. They just called it the 101st. These are the kinds of stories I think still deserve to be told properly. If you want more of them, I will keep finding them as long as you keep listening.